Welcome, welcome very, very much to Conversations, where I'm pleased to welcome to the program Albert Glotzer. And Mr. Glotzer is, well, I think it's fair to say he's a democratic socialist or a social democrat.
Yeah.
And he is a progressive who's been on the scene, as it were, for a very long time and had, particularly relevant to what we want to talk today, had close relationship and association with Leon Trotsky back in the days. And Albert Glotzer, welcome very, very much to Conversation.
Thank you.
I wonder, maybe we could bring it up with your own personal background. Now, you were in progressive cause. Maybe you could talk about your own life, as it were, from the time when you were just a youngster, 10 years old, passing out progressive literature in Chicago, or maybe you could bring us in a little bit on your own personal background, and then we could talk about your association with Mr. Trotsky.
I was born in Belarus and came to this country when I was 4 years old.
Uh-huh.
We arrived in the New York Harbor in February 1913 at Castle Garden, which is the old Fort Clinton.
Uh-huh.
And then came out of the immigration office, went to a train, and headed straight for Chicago.
Straight for Chicago, right?
Yeah,
You didn't even.
my father had been there. My mother's younger brother was there, and an uncle or two uncles and cousins. So we had a bit of the family there already.
And may I ask, did you know English at that time, or did you?
No, I didn't know any English.
Oh boy! And you were coming away from some pretty difficult situation in Russia.
Generally,
at that time,
a very modest existence, and sometimes fearful, because at that time the Tsar was still dominant, and there were frequent pogroms in Russia, and living was very difficult. And that's the reason the elders left,
the
male elders, because they also faced military service in the Russian army of 26 years.
26 years?
26 years.
Holy mackerel.
And although they had no rights in the army, theirs was simple service and labor. And so many of them fled before they could be drafted.
And some of those who had fled and come to the United States were your family. And
yes, part of them were members of my family. And, of course, in those years, the Eastern Europeans particularly looked toward the United States as a haven.
Yeah.
And it was part of the vast immigration that began at the end of the 19th century, extended over into the 20th, up until the First World War. Then it stopped when the World War I began.
Yeah.
And it continued again after the war, but at a much slower pace.
Now, when you came into Chicago, you were how old then? If
I was 4.
Only 4. You were just a youngster, right? And
but I remember distinctly the vast difference between coming from a village of about 400 people,
shtetl,
related to each other, or if not blooded relatives, people who were very close to us, as close as relatives, with one dirt street running down the middle of 2 rows of houses.
Right.
And I came to this vast city on a street which had a streetcar running down the middle of it. Lots of people walking up and down, all kinds of activities, stores everywhere.
Yeah.
It was phenomenal to me as a boy.
I'm sure it was. Yeah.
I was startled by it. I had cousins living on Division Street, which is a famous Northwest Side street. I think Studs Terkel wrote a book called Division Street.
All right,
yes. And I began to adapt to life.
Sure, right. I can see you picked up the language right
very quickly.
At that age.
I recall that when my father took my older brother to register in what we called grammar school then, the elementary school, the principal turned to me and asked me in English, do I want to go to school too? I didn't know what she was saying, but my father interpreted her.
Yes.
And I just sort of clammed up because I couldn't answer her.
Right. Now you did now, you know, and maybe I could just show it now because we want to talk about this, and maybe if they could come in on this. This is a book that you published more recently, and it's called Trotsky: Memoir and Critique. It's published by Prometheus Press, which I think is in Buffalo.
Prometheus Books in Buffalo.
I see. Yeah. And this is a book about your account of having had association with Leon Trotsky when he was in Turkey in exile and so forth. And we want to talk about this, which leads me into the fact that you were in progressive circles there, in a sense, in Chicago.
Well,
your family and your
the
setting.
family
and I read that you were passing out pamphlets when you were a young child.
Well, under the influence of my uncle, who was a socialist, he was a Bundist, as he was called in the old country. He belonged to the Jewish Workers' Union, which was the Bund.
Yeah.
And when he came to this country, he was in the Socialist Party of Eugene V. Debs.
Sure enough.
So during elections, he would have us distribute leaflets, stuffed mailboxes in the neighborhood.
This is when you're 10 or 12.
Oh, I was about 10, yeah. I remember one specific election where at this time, Debs did not run for president, but Alan Benson ran for president. But we also had someone running for alderman from our ward, and a socialist running for a state's attorney. And we elected the alderman, and we were convinced that our candidate, William Cunha, a very well-known lawyer in Chicago, was counted out, that he had won the election, but they stole it, which is not unusual in Chicago.
No, no. Right.
And there was always talk in the house about socialism, politics, music, arts. There was a constant flow of people.
And, if I may, there was also all of this activity taking place back home, as it were, back in Soviet Russia, or in Russia, or in the...
Not as easily as it was in the U.S.
Yes,
It
right.
was a free country, and there it was always either underground or sub-underground because of the police surveillance constantly.
Yeah. But you'd had the events of 1917 and earlier...
Not yet, but they came.
Yeah, they did. Well, I mean, when you were growing up.
When I was growing up, I remember when the news came that the Tsar had been overthrown, that extras of the newspapers came out, and they sell them down the streets in those days. And people were hawking the papers, the revolution in Russia, the Tsar overthrown, all the neighborhood, which was... had a lot of immigrants in it from Russia. They poured out into the street, and there was great rejoicing, you know. Yeah. And I got it from them as they expressed their happiness at it all. It reflected on me sitting there listening to it all.
Yeah, it was blowing in the wind.
It sure was. It wasn't as a massive an outpouring as when the war ended. America's participation ended. There, I remember friends of my uncle came to the house at 2:30 in the morning, said, "Everybody up, nobody sleeps, the war is over, out into the streets."
And celebrate.
And the streets were full of people.
Yeah.
Oh, it was a great day for everybody.
But you were raised in a progressive milieu in
I
Chicago.
was raised in that kind of milieu.
Uh-huh.
The family, like many Jewish families, were influenced by the Jewish Daily Forward, which was edited by what they call A.B. Kant. And he really educated the Jewish immigrant first to learn English and then to participate in progressive movements. And the paper itself was full of progressive ideas. And then the Workmen's Circle, which was both a fraternal and insurance organization, had a vast membership and was also part of this educative process going on among the immigrants. And I must say that they became acclimated very quickly and were Americanized quickly. because it was an entirely different life
Yeah, that's
from
right.
what they had
Yeah.
there.
Yeah,
Because in the shtetl, they were farmers.
that's right. Yeah.
My grandfather received land when Alexander II had he marked the end of feudalism, and he recognized that Jews had a right to have land. And there were a number of philanthropists among Jews who were rich.
In Russia.
In Russia, or they may have been in Germany, other lands,
Right,
but
okay.
they saw to it that Jews received help. And in our case, they bought the first land and had it distributed. I don't know what contributions my grandfather made, but some had more land than others, and I assume they paid for their land. And one of the reasons a lot of the uncles of mine left is that there were 16 children born to my grandfather.
Wow.
And they couldn't all be cared for at one time or another. They went to work. They went to the city of Pinsk, which was 7 versts. What is that? I don't know, 10 miles or so from the village. And they went to work, mostly in a match factory.
A vorst is a measure, a unit of measure?
I don't know.
Like a kilometer or something?
No, something like that. It
Yeah.
wasn't very far. As a matter of fact, our village of Ivanik is incorporated into the city of Pinsk today,
I see,
which is a very old city, but not a very modern one. It still has a lot of dirt streets.
Yeah. But you were brought up through the public schools in Chicago then, educated
Yes,
in public
I
schools?
went to
and
the
in all
public schools. They were good schools, and I went to a particularly good one that was run by, we used to call her a Prussian. An old, educated woman who was German in origin, but very tough and very strict. So I think we learned well, and it was a school that they tried to pump culture into us as kids, too. Because we had statues of Mozart and Beethoven and paintings by Rubens and the Dutch painters, trying to create a nice milieu for us.
Well, I happen to know from our personal conversations that you picked up a lot of that somewhere, and you may have gotten it from the good Prussian school
one way or
teachers.
another, you absorbed it.
Yeah.
Even if you didn't know you were absorbing it, you did.
Right.
So,
and all the while also in this progressive political vein and so forth, and keeping track of socialist development. It was a heady time in a certain thing
we were
after that revolution, because that was changing the whole dynamic of the world.
well, in addition to which we were attracted to sports, baseball in the first place. We devoured, the first things we read were Horatio Alger, which we bought in the 5 and 10 cent stores. But then came baseball, and that absorbed my brother and me completely. We read the statistics, we read the directions on how to play baseball, the rules of the game, and we played it daily.
Did you get to be pretty good? Did you get to be pretty good? What
I was
position
pretty
did you
good.
play? What
I
position
played
did you
outfield and first base.
First base and
I was a
outfield.
left-handed, so they wouldn't let me play shortstop or second or third. I had to play first base.
Well, all right.
But it was a sport that we played every day. We had a large park in our neighborhood, a Humboldt Park, with big baseball diamonds, public and free and full of room of all kinds. And we played the streets, which, unlike Manhattan, were wide and empty. It was still in the days of the horse.
Yes.
And so we would take the corners and take the 4 corners and make bases out of them and play that way. And there were a lot of empty lots, what we called prairies.
Yeah.
That the room was there.
Yes, indeed.
And we didn't have to play stickball. We played
real
softball
thing,
and
right.
baseball.
Yeah, right.
It was a great place.
And they used to bring the ice regularly with those horse-drawn carts, 25, 50, 75 pounds of ice. And
Oh, yes,
yeah,
blocks
sure.
of ice
Right.
and a wooden ice box with a pan underneath it.
Right.
because you had to get the water collected and out into the sink.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you'd have an overflowed kitchen.
All these changes are going on. Now, when, if I may, because you've got this book on Trotsky, and you had an incredible association with him, when did you get involved in, let's say, socialist politics, or to the point where, as you did do, and you can recount to us, you traveled actually and were in the company of Trotsky? Maybe you could share a little with the audience Trotsky, the makeup of the communist or socialist elements in Russia itself, and talk a little bit about
well, you know, the Russian Revolution produced a split in the international socialist world between what they call the Reformists, the Social Democrats, and the Bolsheviks, who were revolutionaries and led by Lenin, who introduced a new kind of radical movement. Violent, highly disciplined, centralized, a movement in a state of warfare all the time. But in the early days, my uncle was a socialist. He was involved in that dispute. The Bolshevik Revolution, which was really a putsch, an insurrection, not a revolution, because the revolution that overthrew the Tsar had already taken place in February 1917, led by Menshevik social revolutionaries and some capitalist parties or bourgeois parties, the cadets. They were responsible for the overthrow of the Tsar and set up a provisional committee which came under the leadership of Kerensky.
Yes, that's right.
Whose father, incidentally, was Lenin's teacher.
Didn't realize
in
that.
Simbirsk, where he was born and raised. But my uncle, in the course of these disputes, thought that the communist movement was the way to go.
A lot of people were beginning to think that, and came to think that.
He set up a commune called Commune Herald. They were going to go to Russia to help reconstruct society. They would set up a dairy farm, and among the members there was Benny Goodman's sister.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah. And he went to Russia. He had joined the Communist Party. He was active in the trade union. He was a member of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers and one of the leaders of the big strike in 1910 in Chicago, where they organized Hart, Schaffner, and Marx. So he went there and he ran into the bureaucracy.
In the Soviet
Union. It was unbelievable to him because he thought, gee, here's the socialist revolution. We're going to build a new world and everything. And first he'd sit in offices for hours. Nobody would talk to him, or if they talked to him, they were very rude. And his object was to get land to set up a dairy so they could supply a city with milk.
To help this socialist thing along, yeah.
So they would offer him land in the steppes 500 miles from a city, no roads. Yeah. There's still an absence of roads in Russia. And he came back from his visit. He quit the Communist Party, went back to the Socialist Party, reported to the members of the Commune, and said this is impossible. Spoke about the state of the country and the inability to get anywhere in their endeavor to set up the Commune.
What year would this have been?
This was in 1923.
Okay, now, okay, if we could take it back, and now Trotsky. Where does Trotsky fit into this?
Well, Trotsky was very popular in the U.S. First, the names of Lenin and Trotsky were always joined in talk in the radical movement and in the press. Every time the press reported on events in Russia, they would report about Lenin and Trotsky. Because Trotsky led the overthrow of the Provisional Committee and he organized the Red Army.
Absolutely,
and, he was the first foreign minister. And so that without him, there wouldn't have been an insurrection. There wouldn't have been a successful takeover. But without Lenin, there wouldn't have been anything. Yeah. So that there.
And Mr. Stalin at this time in the early phases, where was Mr. Stalin?
He was nowhere.
He was nowhere. He was a.
He was a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. He was what they call a practical. He was not a theoretician. He was not an intellectual, but he was a rather tough man, and he would carry out party policy, and he would engage in expropriations of all kinds.
Yeah, well, Trotsky definitely was an intellectual.
Oh, he was an intellectual. He was a writer, the outstanding speaker of the party. And after 14 years of fighting against Lenin's conception of a party, he gave up his democratic fight and accepted Lenin's leadership and joined the Bolshevik Party in the course of the revolutionary events of 1917. He had never been a member of the Bolshevik Party until then. And one of the elements in the struggle between him and Stalin was that he was not a Bolshevik. They were old Bolsheviks, but he was never a Bolshevik, and he always disagreed with Lenin, and they would print stuff from 1905 and 1912 and all these years to show that he was Lenin's opponent and not an associate.
Yeah, and he always had, I mean, in contradistinction to Stalin, for instance, or from others, he always had a view of socialism as being, it's international, that it has to be fought in all the world, and you can't build socialism in one country. And that was a major theme that divided the socialist camp, right?
But there was a lot of ambiguity in there. While most of the leaders of Lenin's party agreed with that because that was Lenin's point of view. But there were ambiguities on Lenin's part that, well, we'll take power, we'll build towards socialism. And Stalin says, see what Lenin said, we got to build socialism. And, well, you know what kind of socialism they got. They couldn't feed the people, they couldn't clothe them, and they couldn't create any housing for them.
Now, you're coming up as a young man, and you were interested in Trotsky, and you got it into your own head. And maybe you can recount this personally.
Well, I had joined
to go and meet with the man, and maybe you could share a little of that.
I joined a youth organization of the Communist Party, partly under the influence of my uncle, and because of the nature of society in the 20s. You know, people look back on it, they call it the prosperity decade, the jazz age. But actually, it was after the First World War. There was great discontent. The efforts to organize in unions in this country was always met with fierce opposition and the use of the National Guard and the police in defense of the interests of business and commerce and mining interests. So there were strikes where workers were shot, arrested, jailed, and reached its peak in the 30s when I was still living in Chicago.
Rouge,
And in Chicago, in the steel mills, where they shot, I don't know, 35, 40 steel workers in the back.
That was
running away from the police, and they were standing there shooting them like they were taking target practice.
Right.
And that kind of atmosphere radicalized a minority of people in the country.
Even during the 20s, which were relatively prosperous.
You had a large miners' union who were, I think, the most militant workers in this country. Because people have no idea what living in a mining camp is, or working in a coal mine means to an individual, and the effect it has upon their life.
John Lewis is starting to make his mark.
He was a tough labor leader. I know because I went down to the Illinois coal fields in the movement fighting him because he ran that union with an iron fist.
I see, right.
There was about as much democracy there as there was in the Russian Union.
But you had picked up on Leon Trotsky. And
what happened
Trotsky had been, maybe you could say, he had been forced out of Russia and he was in exile, and maybe you could...
That fight took place while we were in the party, but we weren't conscious of its significance until about 1928, when one of the leaders of the party went to the 6th Congress of the Communist International and for the first time learned what Trotsky stood for. Nobody knew what he stood for because they didn't print his articles or speeches. And when we heard what he actually stood for, we were amazed and won over by his ideas. But the minute you did that, you were already out of the party, even though you hadn't been expelled yet. But you knew it was coming. And I, for example, demanded a discussion of Trotsky's views and so on. Didn't make any difference. The party didn't countenance that. I was brought up on charges together with the organizer of the party in Chicago, and we were expelled just like that. There was no more discussion. That's over.
He was expelled from the country.
And he was expelled.
What year was he expelled from Russia?
He was expelled from the party in 1927 and exiled to Siberia. And he was in exile in 1928. And in 1929, he was deported from Russia.
All right. Yeah, right.
The country which he did so much to create.
Right, exactly.
He gets deported to
Amazing.
Turkey.
Yeah, right.
Now, meanwhile, we were, a number of us expelled from the party and organized the Trotskyist. Yes. We organized a national organization called the Communist League of America, left opposition, because a number of people joined us after we were expelled because they were outraged by the expulsions. So that we had an organization of several hundred people that we didn't expect. And we had the convention in Chicago. And I was one of those in charge of arranging the convention. Naturally, we had a great deal of fervor. We were like missionaries.
Yes.
We had become acquainted with a whole body of new ideas. And we pursued it. We began to fight about the nature of Russian society, the conditions of Russian workers and people at large. You know, it was called a worker state.
Right.
We were gradually evolving to the point where many of us didn't think it was anything like a worker state. It was a bureaucratic society, that we knew in advance. But we began to find the disagreements with Trotsky. But before that, I had already moved to New York in 1930. I was working for the Interborough Transit Company, the IRT.
Yes.
In an underground shop, and 7 days a week.
Yeah, working hard. But and what year was it that you went and joined Trotsky in Turkey?
That's it. That's the point. I quit the job. I couldn't stand being underground there all the time. I didn't see any future in it either, although it was still tough to get a job.
And we ought to mention, you did pick up court reporting capability.
Yes, I did, after I came back from Europe.
Anyway, but you took it on your own, as I understand, to go and visit with
I decided I wanted to meet
yeah.
I wanted to see Trotskyists in Europe, their organization, and then go on to Turkey. And I wanted to go to Europe.
All right, young man.
I considered it part of growing up. And so I did. I went to Europe. I stopped in France first. I met people. I talked to a lot of new acquaintances. And I went on to Turkey. And I arrived there, and here was this shingled house that was unpainted for years, very poor, modest quarters. And the great leader of the Red Army and founder of the new society, he was there with his wife, a little grandson, a secretary who was also a caretaker. This was the Trotskyist central headquarters.
And this towering intellectual figure. And he was living in a very modest and in a precarious situation, in a sense, because there were...
a country full of secret police, Russian secret police, and battled with a tremendous power, the Russian state, all by himself, with little groups around the country, and in a state of semi-poverty.
Yes, right. And you, among other things, he was also under physical danger.
He was.
And you took
constantly.
it upon yourself to be in a certain sense, a bodyguard to the man.
As long as I was there.
Involved and so forth, and maybe you could share a little bit of...
When I came there, I found his secretary there, Jan Frankel, who was a Czech youth, very capable, a wizard in languages. He spoke Czech, Turkish, French, German, and he was picking up English, just like that. But there he had the responsibility for the correspondence and taking care of people, and being Trotsky's foreign minister, dealing with the Turkish government, what rights he had, where he could go or not go. And the problem of security.
Yes,
he was the security. So I relieved him. I joined the army.
Yeah.
I wrapped a pistol around me, and I patrolled the gardens at night, and changing over with him, and then accompanied Trotsky on fishing trips. And then we went to a hunt once while I was there, and we went along as guards, although he had 2 police guards from the Turkish government there, and guides, hunting guides.
People were aware that he was under threat.
Oh, yes, and they knew it. Everybody knew him. He by this time, no matter where he went, that visage of the little beard, mustache, and that straight, upright stance, as he has a big chest, and he stood up straight like, like a warrior.
And he was still putting out literature, and he was still putting
writing
forth
constantly.
This large-scale international view of the need for a worldwide revolutionary consciousness.
Well, not so much that at that time, but a lot of anti-Stalin literature.
Well, okay.
He's the first one to educate the world on what Stalin was, who he was, and he was the first one to use the word Stalinism.
All right. I didn't realize
It became adopted by everybody in later years. He used it all the time. But he was writing the history of the Russian Revolution at the time. It was a 3-volume work put out by Simon & Schuster here. At the time I arrived, he was in the middle of the 2nd volume.
I see, right.
And he said to me, look, I can't stop and talk now. The publisher
waiting for
is beating me over the head, and they want the stuff right away. So I said, all right, I'll wait.
Yes.
I enjoyed being there.
Yes, and sure.
So he said, I'll be through in 2 weeks. Well, when I left, almost 2 months later, he still hadn't finished the 2nd volume.
Right.
But I listened to him dictate, which is the way he wrote the book.
Right.
He had notes in his hand. He walked up and down the room. I could hear him dictating, paragraph after paragraph, page after page.
Doing this in Russian, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That was his best writing language.
Uh-huh.
And he had a Russian typist. She would take the dictation on the machine, and then he would take each 8.5 by 11 page and paste it together until he had a big roll, and that's the way he used to correct it.
Right.
He had a table there on which he had a series of street maps of Petrograd, and he checked every event, every place on these street maps.
Getting
the
it
whole
right.
City, the whole city was there. And I had discussions with him, first on the U.S., and he was most concerned with events in Germany. Hitler was then the big threat.
Yeah.
And he advocated a united front between the communists, socialists, and democratic parties to stop Hitler. That's when Stalin developed his unique theory that the main danger in Germany is not Hitler, but the social democrats.
Amazing. Yeah.
And of course, that meant that there would never be any united fight against the Nazis. As a matter of fact, the Communist Party there made blocks with the Hitlerites against the Social Democrats. They tried to overthrow the government of Prussia, which was social democratic. They made a block with the Nazis to overthrow the Social Democrats.
Amazing. Yeah.
Well, the result is that all his agitation, which was continuous for 3 or 4 years, meant little. The communist movement was determined not to associate with Social Democrats.
Mm-hmm. Now, you, if I may, pick up the trail with Mr. Trotsky, because Mr. Trotsky was in Turkey then when you met. You were here with him,
yeah.
And then he went to other places. He ended up finally in Mexico, where you also were. And we do want to be sure and talk about the fact that you were the court reporter,
yeah.
as it were, for the
well, you know, when I got
trial.
back from Europe, I had gone to Germany after that, and then I went to England, where, together with Max Shachtman, who was an associate of mine, started the ball rolling there to establish a Trotskyist organization in Great Britain. When I went back, I couldn't get any work anymore. This was the depth of depression.
Yeah.
My father said, "Come back to Chicago, I'll get you a job." He was a milkman.
Yeah.
So I went back. He didn't have a job for me.
No.
There was a Communist Party member whom I knew very well, who had been in the youth movement. And we were very friendly, although he couldn't acknowledge it publicly. Mm-hmm. Who was a court reporter himself.
Right.
And he said to me, "Why don't you get a profession or trade?" He said, "You never know when the party does something to
like
you." I'm sorry about that.
No, that's all right. Are you okay? Yeah. And that's when you went ahead and you started to study shorthand, right? And if I'm saying you studied Pittman shorthand, I think,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
He said it's a good thing to have, because if the party says they don't want you anymore, you can always go back to work very easily.
Yeah, right. It's
Which
good to have
I
a day
did.
job.
I did.
Right? Yeah, right.
I studied shorthand with an old instructor who was secretary of the American Association for the Advancement of Atheism, and was a close friend of Clarence Darrow.
Oh, yes. During the time of the Scopes trial.
Yeah. The Scopes trial, which was put in book form, was part of the material he dictated to me in my learning to become a court reporter.
No, really. I'll be darned. That was an amazing trial. That was Clarence Darrow and Bryant,
It
right?
was great.
Yeah. Did you get down there to that trial? No. Okay.
And I went to work in Chicago as a court reporter.
Picking up Pittman shorthand.
Yeah, I wrote it. I worked hard to pick it up. It was a splendid shorthand system.
Better than Greg, you think?
Oh, yes.
All right,
No
okay.
compare.
This is the way people make these things. And so, if I may, I don't want to lead you here, but if I may, now Trotsky had to go. He ended up down in Mexico.
He ended up in Mexico because the Norwegian government, under the pressure of Stalin, kicked him out.
Uh-huh. He'd gone to Norway from
France.
From France. Okay.
And through the intervention of Diego Rivera,
the famous
who got to the president of Mexico, Cardenas.
Yes.
Cardenas said, "No question about it. We'll give him a visa. Let him come here. He can live here." He went to Mexico. And at that time, the Moscow trials began,
right.
And the purges. And all the former leaders of the Bolshevik Party were being executed left and right by Stalin.
It was a horror, yeah, right.
They were accused of being agents of Hitler, agents of the Mikado, in the service of the British Foreign Office. Mm-hmm. Went on and on like that.
And so it was John Dewey who they began.
Well,
they
the American
the
Trotskyists organized a movement called Committee for the Defense of Leon Trotsky. I'm going to take one of these.
Surely, by all means, yeah.
And a number of outstanding intellectuals became members of the committee.
Including Mr. John Dewey.
He was not a member of that committee, but they set up a commission of inquiry. And through Sidney Hook, they got Dewey to agree to be the chairman. He was the most respected academician in the country.
Perhaps in the world at that time, yeah, right, amazing, towering.
And he had been to Russia, and he examined their educational system, and so that he was not an enemy of Russia.
Right.
He didn't agree with communism or socialism, but he was not an enemy.
Yeah, and he was in favor of an open society, an open investigation of ideas.
He had progressive views on education and
certainly did
classes and things of that sort. So, despite the opposition of his family, because he was then 79 years old, and didn't want him to get involved,
right,
he decided to act as chairman of this commission, in which there was Suzanne La Follette, who was an editor of a liberal magazine, and connected to the La Follette family of Wisconsin. It was Ben Stolberg, who was an outstanding labor journalist. I think he worked for the New York Times and a number of other syndicated pages. There was Otto Rühle, an old German social democratic biographer of Karl Marx. They had an attorney for the commission, John Finnerty, who was an old-time labor lawyer for the IWW in this country and other unions, very skilled lawyer. And they went down to Mexico to take depositions of Trotsky, to examine the charges in the Moscow trials
against Trotsky,
Trotsky, and offered him a tribune to answer the charges. The ambassador to the United States from Russia was invited to attend. The Communist Party of Mexico was invited to send representatives. Of course, none of them came.
Because Trotsky, again, keep in mind, he was on the outs, as it were. He was exiled, and he is still pursuing this notion, and this is something that's important from a Trotskyist perspective, is that the revolution will occur in all the world rather than, again, in one place where it would have a focus. That's something we want to keep in mind.
Yeah, because he said you can't build socialism in a single country.
Right.
You can only build it on a world scale.
Right.
Because of the world division of labor. The economy itself is not a national economy, it's truly a world economy.
Well, we're sure learning that now in the times of the World Trade Organization, aren't we? At least for capital it is, anyway. But in any event, and you were asked to come down. Were you asked to come down?
I was asked.
You were, in a sense, honored to be the reporter of that, right?
I was asked and told.
And told, right? Okay.
Because the secretary of the Defense Committee said, we'll pay your expenses. And we won't pay you for it, but we'll pay your expenses.
Yes.
Well, I would have gone down.
Sure, of course.
Because I considered it a very historic event.
It certainly was, yeah.
And it was absolutely a brilliant occurrence. And I took his testimony for 8 days, all by myself, without relief. And I felt then, as I took it, that the average reporter wouldn't have been able to take it.
Right.
It was such a sectarian kind of language. It was political language. It was a language of the radical movement, the socialist movement in general, and the Bolshevik movement in particular. And I had an acquaintance with it, so that anything that came out in the hearing in language, I was familiar with instantly.
And was this all conducted in English?
It was all conducted in English, except when Trotsky, hunting for a word, would pop in French or German. And it cost me some trouble when I was transcribing the note, because I once spent almost a whole day on one note, when suddenly the subconscious came up and said, he's not talking English there.
Yes,
That's
right,
French.
right.
And he used a word for assassination or execution, not assassination, execution in French. And I finally got it and passed over that hump.
Right.
But I recorded hundreds and hundreds of pages, and they came out in book form called The Case of Leon Trotsky, issued by the Commission.
Commission of Inquiry, you're right.
And then several months later,
that was at the time of the Moscow trials, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
several months later, after examining all the documents, and he had, in secret, letters from Lenin, documents of the Central Committee, the Political Committee, the Commission went through all the stuff. Because the trials were such a palpable frame-up. It was unbelievable. An example, they have Trotsky's son, Sadov, meeting a Russian in Copenhagen at the Bristol Hotel. There was no Bristol Hotel then because it had burned down in 1917.
Yeah, right.
So Trotsky said the secret police were using an old Baedeker. They didn't know that it didn't exist anymore. Or they had a leading party member in Russia, a member of the Central Committee, meet Trotsky in Oslo to get directions on working with the Nazis against Russia. It turns out, in December 1935, when he was supposed to have flown to Oslo, the airports are closed. They're covered with ice, and no planes can land. You know, things like that went all through the hearings. And, of course, it was laughable, but what, the Russians don't care.
Well, you know, it's interesting, Mr. Trotsky. Now unfortunately, I mean, Trotsky was, of course, assassinated.
He was assassinated
by
a clever plot. They had tried several times. They had the artist Alfredo Siqueiros, whom I call the gunman artist, organize an attack on Trotsky's house. They botched it. They got into the house because one of the guards, named Sheldon Hart, who had been in the Trotskyist movement about 6 months, went down there as a guard, opened the door to them at night, which is an absolute violation of any kind of defensive system, no matter where. And they came in with their machine guns, and they shot up the house, and they thought they had Trotsky. Of course, Trotsky and his wife, who were old campaigners, were lying flat on the floor, but the only one hit was their grandson.
Good grief.
Who got hit
what a situation.
In the foot. So, of course, the secret police had to, under the instructions of Stalin, now you do a better job next time, but I want him dead. You're dealing with a paranoid.
Yes, right.
And a killer, an absolute killer, who would say to an old friend of his, a party worker, don't worry about the police. You have nothing to worry about. Everything will be okay. I'll see to it. And then when his friend leaves, he get on the telephone, shoot him, but beat him up before you shoot him.
Oh, Lord, yeah.
That went on constantly.
It finally ended up where they had some prince or duke or something put a pickaxe in his head.
Yeah, and they did that by getting a member of the Trotskyist organization in New York involved through a friend of hers who was a member of the American Workers' Party of A.J. Musty and Sidney Hook. They were friends, but they separated because Sylvia Agaloff, the girl, became a Trotskyite, and Ruby Weil, who became the agent, remained away. But they went to Europe together, and Ruby Weil introduced her to this Mercader, Ramon Mercader, whose mother was an agent of the GPU. And, of course, he courted her, and she being a single woman, and he was supposed to be a count or a prince, Belgian. He was attractive man. She fell for him.
And he used that to get inside the...
Now, Louis Boudin's, who was a member of the American Workers' Party and associate of Musty and Hook, became a Stalinist. He joined the Communist Party. He was editor of Daily Worker. He was assigned the task of gathering the group to see to the assassination of Trotsky. And he describes in his book, after he went back to the Catholic Church, of the people he assembled to do it.
And it was a thing. Now his legacy, this Trotsky's legacy, continues. There's still many people who will study with Mr. Trotsky, and the socialist movement, despite the fact the Soviet Union has come apart and so forth, there still is this movement. Now, they've had a hard time keeping it together. I mean, you have the Fourth International Tendency, you have Shachtmanites, you have all these different there are more divisions going on there.
We broke with Trotsky because as we got closer to the war, we began to disagree with Trotsky's view that Russia was a degenerated workers' state. We were against the invasion in Finland. We were against the Nazi pact. We were against the division of Poland. But Trotsky was caught by his own theory. He said Stalin is nationalizing property in Finland. He's nationalizing property in Poland. And even though we disagree with the invasion and so on, we have to support him because he's bringing socialism to these countries. We wouldn't buy that. And we began to challenge him on the nature of Russia. And we, since the leadership of the American Trotskyists couldn't defend themselves against our assault, he took over the fight. And, but he didn't convince us. And we finally arrived at a point of view after we broke that Russia was a new type of society, a slave society, and we called it bureaucratic collectivism.
What did you call it? State capitalism?
No, we didn't think it was capitalism. We thought it was something new.
Okay, right.
And of course, what the theory means today in the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's on the shelf.
Yeah, well, you know, you have the legacy of Leon Trotsky, and you have these people, and people who are celebrating or crowing in a certain sense. Fukuyama, Francis Fukuyama says that with the downfall of the Soviet Union, that's the end of it. It's capitalism has won. It's going to be capitalism from now to the end of the universe, and that this socialist thing is nothing. But I wonder if when we didn't get a chance to talk much about Harrington. We didn't get a chance to talk about Cornel West now as Democratic.
Well, they're minor figures, and in 10 years there'll be less and less talk.
But we have a war. We only have a couple minutes left, and everything. You've been right with some of the towering figures and so forth. We have a couple minutes left, but you know we have this. GATT has passed now. We have international. We have international use of international wages on an international scale. Wages are coming down. Downsizing is coming. Technology.
Well, that's a whole new problem in society.
Do you think that there might be contradictions that are built into the system such as we
no
have
question
now,
about
to where some of these things that Mr. Trotsky was addressing and some of the people were holding to him, that those things might yet come to the fore? We've only got a couple minutes left.
I know. They'll come back in a different form.
Yeah.
And would require different answers. Sidney Hook used to say, there's as much socialism, Marxian socialism in Russia as there is Adam Smith capitalism in the United States.
That was an interesting thing to say,
and, it's true. Capitalism itself is altered in so many fundamental ways.
Yeah.
It's altogether different society than it was 100 years ago.
Absolutely.
And it's going to be vastly different 25 years from now. It is changing very rapidly.
Very rapidly.
the computerization of the world is going to have a tremendous effect on it.
Well, it's just now beginning to really
beginning to feel it, and there are grave dangers in it. There's an interesting story in the Times yesterday about a computer criminal. Mm-hmm. I read the page and a half of the Times on it. The very skillful way in which he collected credit cards, entered the files of commercial institutions, big companies, and collected all their secrets.
Yeah, that's right.
They had to get a Japanese expert to catch him.
Yeah, right.
And he gradually went after him until he located him in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the FBI got him.
And they got him in computer.
But he went on for years.
But I mean, even in the sense of, you know, like they would talk, the theoreticians would talk about major forces that are there. The downsizing, there's tens and hundreds of thousands of people who are being downsized in temporary work. And
well, look at it in the country now.
Working class is becoming to where there's going to be so many people who are going to be disfranchised.
The great American industries have been declining. The American worker has been slowly declining. Here you have a rise in the economy, and the workers getting less.
That's right.
And that's contrary to the way capitalism developed. Every time they expanded, workers improved their position.
That's right.
Now they expand without labor.
Well, Jerry Rifkin has an incredibly interesting book, A World Without Work, that the labor is being done by technology and we haven't caught up to it, and there are these changes. And some of those contradictions that were talked about that we may not, those who think that we're all hunky-dory may do well to rediscover and revisit some of the territory you've done. And I'm really sorry. We could go on talking, but we're right out of time. We're right out of time here.
Okay.
But I just remind you, it's been your pleasure again. Show again just quickly here at the end. We've been talking with Albert Glotzer. He was at the trials in Mexico. He knew Mr. Trotsky. He's been a hand of many of these historic developments. Happy to have been able to bring you his perceptions. And again, the name of the book is Trotsky, Memoir and Critique, Prometheus Press out of Buffalo. And Albert, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We in Conversation invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for this segment, this program. See you next week.